Have you ever met someone that is really good at remembering names? Is anybody willing to admit if they're good at remembering names? Anybody in the room? Who's bad at remembering names? Thank you. I feel like I'm in good company this morning. As a pastor, one of my biggest frustrations is not being able to remember names. I'm in the people business, right? If you're in sales, you probably should be very good at names and connections and all the things, right? But I should know the names of people, but I end up doing the old church trick where you call everybody brother and sister. You know that? Like, hey, bud, brother, pal. Especially if I see you outside of the element that I'm used to seeing you in. If I run into you at HEB, there's a good chance I won't remember your name. My mind is like, they're not at church, I don't know their name. That's just how my mind works. But they say there's ways that you can learn to be better at names, right? They have all the tricks. The biggest one is simple. You ready for this one? It's life-changing. They say the number one reason why people don't remember names is they don't pay attention when people tell them their names. All right, I'm guilty, all right? This is not a secret around Collective, is that if I'm ever talking to you and my eyes are not looking at you, I'm not listening to you. Just tell me, Derek, bring it in a little bit, all right? Because I don't do it intentionally. It's just like there's a squirrel, there's a butterfly, there's a screen up there. There's a lot of stuff happening in my mind. You have no chance of remembering someone's name if you're not paying attention. Another helpful one is name association. Like if you, for example, we have a neighbor down the road. His name's Mike. Our sons played baseball against each other a few seasons ago. We live on a street called Mesquite Drive. And so I know him now. I don't even know his last name, but it's Mike on Mesquite. So I see him, hey, Mike. Because it's easy to remember at name association. Do y'all do those tricks? Do you repeat their name in the middle of a conversation 12 times to see if you can catch it? Why do we put effort into remembering someone's name? Because it makes them feel valued, doesn't it? If I can look at you in the face and call you your name, especially after the first time meeting you, please don't test me after the service if I just met you this morning. But if I call you by your name, immediately there's this sense of value that you're like, wow, like that person really cares about who I am and they want to get to know me. There's that value that we have. Our names, although that they have meaning, if we look them up and study what our name meaning is, they are more about what others call us. It's like an identity tool. I identify our friend Casey O'Quinn as Casey. I know him as Casey or Mr. Mustache, but Casey. That was good, wasn't it? Thank you. All right. What differentiates our name, though, from God's name is that when people call us our name, it's about identity. But when we learn the names of God, we are learning not just his identity, but we are learning his character. There's plenty of people that we know in this world that maybe even have the same name as us, right? But their character is not very good. They might not be a person of character. That sounds harsh, but it's just the reality of life. There's people in this world that don't have good character. You can't trust what they say. You can't trust what they do. So when we learn about somebody's name, it's not necessarily about their character, it's identity. But when we learn about God's names, we learn about his character. And so we're starting this new series on the names of God. And in this series, we're going to focus in on what we call the compound names of God. Now, we could spend over a year, if not longer, of studying all the names of God week by week and just going one by one. We could do that, and it would be worthwhile. But for this series, we're going to focus in just on the compound names of God. And the reason I say that is I just want you to know this is not going to be exhaustive. This is not going to be a complete list of all the names of God that we're studying in this series. Because I don't want you to leave here and like, well, Derek only knows just a few names of God. That's not what we're doing. We're doing kind of an overview of these compound names of God. Now, most of these combinations, these compound names of God begin with the word Jehovah. Jehovah Jireh is where we're going to be this morning. We just sang about it, right? But in the Hebrew, where do we get this name of God? Because in the Hebrew, what we hear often and what we read often is Yahweh. You might hear the covenant name of God is Yahweh. Now, we know that. We sing about it. We have songs in our sets all the time that say the word Yahweh. We know that's a name of God, but we need to kind of really dive in just a little bit more here, because in the Hebrew is a written language that has no vowels. So could you imagine the translator's job of translating the Hebrew text with no vowels in all their writings? That's a little bit difficult, isn't it? So actually in the Hebrew Bible, the name of God, Yahweh, looks like this. YHWH. We would say Yahweh, right? You might see a millennial or a Gen Z with a tattoo that has just those letters on it because that's what we do. Nobody's safe this morning, I'm just telling you, all right? I'm feeling spicy. This is why scholars have had a hard time ever even knowing the actual pronunciation of the name of Yahweh because it doesn't actually say it. And it's like, they added some vowels in there, which is where we get the word Yahweh that you'll see there. But it's actually, you put the vowels in there, and it just doesn't make sense in English, does it? Jehovah. Doesn't make sense in our, so it's Jehovah is what we say. So today we're studying Jehovah Jireh, which means this: the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide. We just sang about it in one of my favorite songs, Jireh. This name comes all the way back from the book of Genesis. So if you have your Bible, Genesis chapter 22 is where we're going to be this morning in the story of Abraham and Isaac. Probably not where you thought we were going to be when you thought about God providing, but this is where we are. Genesis chapter 22, Abraham and Isaac, and this is what it says. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said to him, here I am. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose, and they went to a place of God, which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come to you again. Verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and so they went both of them together. And then Isaac said to his father, Abraham, I love this part, Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? We're missing something here, Dad. Verse 8, Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. This is a very famous story. The Old Testament is full of stories like this. We call these narrative stories. They can feel a little bit extreme, right? These are the kind of stories, if you were to try to enact today, you're probably going to be in prison for the rest of your life. This is something that only crazy people would do, right? When you hear a story that somebody said, I've sacrificed something to the Lord, like something actual living. And it's like, well, we don't do that anymore, right? We don't live under the old covenant. And so God is not going to ask those things. So we have to have an understanding when we're reading these narrative stories, as that these stories are not prescriptive, but they are things that we can look at these stories and learn about the character of God, who God is, and we can learn about what it looks like to be a person of faith as we walk out this life of Christianity. And so we take these principles and we learn about them. And so here's the main idea that I want you to hear this morning. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. Many times, the provision of Jehovah is seen on the other side of a struggle. Many times, the provision of Jehovah comes on the other side of a struggle. As we dive into this, I think it's important that we define what provision is. Provision. What is provision? If God is Jehovah Jireh and he provides, then what does provision look like for us in our lives? Many times I think we use this phrase on things that are more material, don't we? It's like, well, the Lord provided the house. The Lord provided that vehicle that I really wanted. Can the Lord provide those things? Absolutely, especially in this market, right? Lord can provide those things. The Lord can do things and move and work in those situations. But when we think about provision, we sometimes only look at it from a sense of like providing a house or a car or a vehicle or something like that. Should we celebrate those things? Yes. But we have to be careful to not confuse provision with blessing. We got to be careful to not confuse provision with blessing. How is God providing for you in your daily life? What does it look like for God to provide in the daily that you have? Provision is God giving us what we need. Blessings can be a gift that we may even want. So we got to be careful. Just something for us to focus on. Because if we do confuse them, what happens is that when we don't get the car or we don't get the house, then we automatically start thinking that the Lord is not providing for me. And we'll actually post something on Facebook on our $1,500 iPhone, right? Let's think about it for a moment. Is the Lord providing for us or not? So here's the first point that I want us to get this morning. 3 points. And the first one is this, is that God's provision does not give us a pass from testing. God's provision does not give us a pass from testing. Something that I'm learning way too late in life is that the best things in life usually come through hard work and discipline. Usually come through a struggle. Aside from salvation, I want to make this very clear. Aside from salvation, we can't work to earn that. We can't do anything to make our lives more apt to salvation. None of those things. That is only by the work of Christ. So just so everybody understands, please don't send me an email. But for the most good things in life, there's a struggle. Kids, right? Kids are a huge blessing in life. But kids, it is a difficulty to raise children. Your wants and your desires sometimes go to the wayside for the sake of your children and raising your kids. They're not a burden, but it's a struggle, is it not? It's challenging to think about all the different ways and the things that we have to wrestle through in this life. You want to be physically fit? You have to torture your muscles and drink kale smoothies all the time. And who wants to do that? No one. I don't care what any influencer says on Instagram. No one likes that. You want to grow as a leader? It takes sacrifices, doesn't it? You gotta be willing to do what other leaders and what other employees are not doing if you want to be a leader. A lot of the good things and the blessings that come in life are seen on the other side of this thing of struggle and discipline and doing what others aren't willing to do. When we think of God providing for us in this, many times it can be this genie in a bottle sense. The prosperity gospel that had so many years ago infiltrated the American church. And we bought it hook, line, and sinker for many. And it's just like, and we're going to say it, we're going to claim it, and it's going to happen. Right? It's almost like we made ourselves little gods of telling God what he's going to do. But what happens with that prosperity gospel is that we think that he has to provide for us without any struggle, without any testing, without any problems. That if you're provider, then you provide for us and we don't have to worry about anything. We don't have to struggle. We don't have to have stress of life. None of those things. We can just ignore that because you're a provider and you're going to make it happen. And that's just not the case. We see it all throughout the scriptures, don't we? Abraham in this story. See the story of Job. We see it in the story of Elijah wrestling with the angel. He's not going to let go until the Lord blesses him. Boom, his hip socket's out of place and he walks with a limp the rest of his life. God is provider, but he does not remove the struggle from us. Because it's in the testing of our faith that we see where we really are spiritually. This is not to be harsh, but it's just a reality. I know it's true in my life. Many times, we think that we're doing better spiritually than we really are. Think about it for a moment. If you were to take an actual inventory of your spiritual life and you say, and again, this is not to earn anything, right? This is just a disciplined life of following the Lord and growing in your knowledge and wisdom of him. But if you were to take an inventory of your life of all the things that you do to grow in your relationship with the Lord, spending time in the Word and spending time in prayer and serving and giving and all the things, like if you were to take an inventory, it's probably going to look a little bit less than what you thought it was in your mind. He doesn't remove the struggle from us. It's in the testing of our faith we see where we are spiritually, this measuring stick of sorts. In fact, in James, the book of James, in his letter, he writes in James chapter 1, verse 2 and 4, very popular passage, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Count it joy as you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. I don't know about you, but when struggles and trials come my way, joy is not usually my first response. Count it joy that you would be tested, that you would be struggled throughout this season. Like that's a little bit different. It feels opposite, but that's the kingdom life. It's the upside down world of the kingdom. Is that we look at it and it's like, well, that doesn't make sense in human nature, but God's saying, no, I want you to count it all joy. I heard an old preacher line that says this: we want all the blessing without any testing. We want all the blessing without any testing. That was where, Al, if you could come back and get on the organ there for a second, because that was that line. We might call it an entitled faith, wouldn't we? Like That God's going to provide for us, and it's like, but you got to do it my way, or it's not going to happen. Does God give good gifts? Yeah. Does he sometimes give us what we ask for? Yeah. But many times the provision that we're asking for is on the other side of difficulty. Let's look at verse 2 of Genesis 22. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I should tell you. It's strange enough, right, that God would ask somebody to sacrifice their son on a burnt offering altar. This is one of those stories that if you have a friend that's an atheist or non-believer, they're going to point to this story like, what kind of loving God would ask of this? But what makes this story even more difficult is this wasn't just an ordinary child. I want you to think about for a moment Abraham, Sarah, right? They're well into their towards the end of their life, and they have this promise that God's going to give them a child, and so they get impatient with the Lord, right? And so they take it into their own hands, and Sarah says, "Hey, go see Hagar, and you can have a baby with her, our servant," which is where we get Ishmael. They went to their own human means, but then the Lord came to Sarah and Abraham and said, "You're going to have a baby in your old age," and so old that Sarah even laughed at the angel when they told her. Like, there's no way. Like, now I'm going to have a baby? But the Lord provided just as he said, and Isaac was born. And if you grew up in church, children's church, you may remember this old classic song that I'm just glad to put this in your mind for the rest of the day. Father Abraham. Thank you. Oh, look, that was good. We should start a choir. Father Abraham, right? This son Isaac was the promise given to Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son, and that Abraham was going to be the father of many nations. All of this was contingent upon their son Isaac. And so God is not just saying, "Hey, I want you to just take your son." God is saying, "I want you to take everything, your son, your promise, your future, all of it, and I want you to take it to the mountain, and I want you to sacrifice it." His dreams, his plans, to give up everything. Sounds a lot like a kingdom life, doesn't it? That God would ask us to sacrifice our own plans and our own dreams and our own future and say, "I want you to live for the kingdom." When we think of God providing, we usually don't think about it in this way. We think of a verse where it's like God will give you the desires of your heart. And yes, he does give us the desires of our heart, but it's not a guarantee without struggle. And here's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that what we want is to have a God that gives us everything we want when we want it without any struggles. And as good as that might sound, we know deep down in our hearts that would not be good for our soul. We know that. We know that in parenting, right? It's the same for us. Here's the second thing, is that God sees what we need before we see it. God sees what we need before we see it. A few years ago, I was encouraged by Lindsay. Y'all, never mind, I'll stop there. I was encouraged by Lindsay to go get my eyes checked out. Because I have horrible eyesight, and I'm kind of a stubborn guy. I don't go to the doctor. I don't go to the dentist. I don't go, none of it. I'm just like, I'm fine. I'm good. I don't need to be checked out. I don't want any needles. I want nothing reaching in my mouth. And same was with my eyes, right? And I think Lindsay got tired of reading street signs for me driving down the road because I couldn't see them. I couldn't read them. I have no clue where I'm going. Thankfully, we have the map, right, on our phones, GPS and directions. I couldn't read the street sign. I'm like, what does that say? And she's like, it's right in front of us. It's right there. So I went and got my eyes checked out, and they were bad. Once I got my glasses on, I was amazed, right? It's like, it sounds silly because it's a simple fix. Just go to the doctor, get your glasses, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. But for me, it's like I put them on, and I'm like, wow, this is what people see normally. This is pretty awesome. You start to see things that you didn't notice before. You start to be able to read a street sign on your own. Something that's hard for us to understand, but it's important for us to understand, is that God does not see with a limited vision like we do. God does not see with a limited vision like we do. We usually see the things that are most important to us in our own life, don't we? What's the most important pressing thing in your life right now is probably something that is right in front of you. Something that's due now, something that you're facing now, right? It's 911 emergency because it's happening in your life right now in front of you. But God is looking at everything from a 30,000-foot view, and he's moving and he's working in ways that we can't even imagine. He's shaping situations, and he's putting people in situations and places and areas of our lives that if we would just be patient with him and trust that he's going to provide in his timing and in his way, it's going to be better than we thought. Genesis 22, let's look down now at verse 9 through 13. It says, and when they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from the heavens and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have withheld your son, that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. In verse 13, and Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Beautiful, beautiful story. But could you imagine being Isaac in this entire situation? I mean, think about it. I love that the Bible leaves out details like this. Like everyone talks about Abraham, and rightfully so, because he's obedient to the Lord. But nobody talks about Isaac. Like, you imagine what he's thinking as they're walking in this journey and going up the mountain? I mean, he even says it, right? Like, I see the wood, like, I've got the knife and the fire. There's something missing, Dad, right? It also doesn't even tell us. It doesn't tell us what Isaac was saying when Abraham was binding him and putting him on the burn pile. There's a lot of tension going on here, and he may not have been able to understand it, but in just a little while he would have. I want you to notice something, is that what is Abraham's response in this entire situation? Obedience and faith. Obedience, faith. Obedience. I think we would do well in our lives if we would just start to walk with the Lord with obedience and with faith. It wasn't easy that he was being asked to sacrifice his son, but it was his very promise that God gave him was holding on to this. Here's something there was something that Abraham said that God is going to provide over and over and over. I think it's just, I want you to look back at verse 5 for a second. If you have your Bible, just keep your finger there. We're going to keep popping in and out there. 22, verse 5. And he says, then Abraham said to his young men, I want you to listen to the bold faith that Abraham asked here. Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Did you catch it? It's like, me and the boy are going to worship. But what does Abraham know to be true about God is that God is the provider. And although there's this defiant faith that he has of like, I'm going to go do this incredibly difficult thing, but even in the middle of it, I trust that the Lord is going to provide. Me and Isaac are going to come back here. Let me ask you a question this morning. When you're walking through a difficult season or when you're being tested, what is our first response? I know what my response is not usually faith. Can we be real and honest for a moment? It's not usually faith. It's usually a little bit of complaining and frustration. Anybody else, or is that just me? Thank you for the honest people in the room. The rest of you, could you please come up here and take the microphone from me? Why would God let something like this happen? And I said this last week, right? There's room for lament, but we can't let faith fall to the side. Obedience and faith, obedience and faith. Remember that God is working out all the details even when we can't see it. So Abraham, he's walking up this mountain with his son, this bold faith that God's going to provide. And Tony Evans says it this way, is that as Abraham was going up one side of the mountain, God was making a ram walk up the other side of the mountain at the same time. It was in his perfect timing that he provided, because that's what he does. It's in his nature, and it's in his character to provide for us. Do you think that Abraham would have preferred God to provide a little bit sooner? You ever thought about that? Like maybe on the way up, the road up, that would be great. If there could be a ram in a thicket on the way up on the mountaintop. All the way until the knife is in your hand. You think that Abraham thought there could be a better way to be tested? I'm sure. But God knew that with a great promise, there needed to be a great testing. And in his time, he provided. This word Jireh, we sang and we're studying this morning, the root of it means to see. To see. I want you to think about that. To see. But when we combine it with the word Jehovah, it means to provide. This is where we get the word provision, right? Like you have good vision, provision. He sees and he provides. This is the reality of who God is. This is his character. When we look in and we lean in on this name, Jehovah Jireh, what we're saying and we're proclaiming is that God sees our need and he meets our need. He sees what we can't see, and he provides what we can't muster up because that's who he is. Third thing is this, is that God's provision is better than what we think we need. God's provision is better than what we think we need. Have you ever had somebody tell you about something that they thought was like the best or the best thing in the world, but you didn't want to experience it because you thought you'd have like a letdown? I'll give you an example. Years ago, everybody used to talk about this burger place called In-N-Out. I know Texas and Whataburger, but it's not even owned by Texans anymore. But In-N-Out, I was afraid. I was like, even when I was in Dallas, I was like, I don't want to go to In-N-Out because I've heard so many good things about it. I don't want to experience it and be like, no, that wasn't as good as I thought. Right? Because what happens, like people talk up a restaurant and you're like, I'm going to go try that restaurant. And it just happens, you're like, wasn't as good as I thought. There's a kind of a letdown. I'm here to tell you, there's no letdown with the burger. With the fries, yes, but no, not with the burger. Just want to let you know. God's provision is better than that, is that he gives us what we need, and it's better than what we wanted. It's better than what we wanted. Abraham up on this mountain looking down on the sun, he ties him up on top of the altar, knife in hand, up in the air, and the Lord provides. In Genesis 22, verse 14, last verse, and he says this. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This is where we get the name Jehovah Jireh from. He stands up there. Abraham stands on this mountain. The Lord provides, and he says, the Lord provides on this mountain. But I want you to notice that what Abraham didn't do, he did not name the place where he was based off of his trial. I think this is key for us to grasp in this story because if you have a very difficult season, what is the temptation for us? Is that we name that season based off of the trial that we had, right? It was the hardest season of my life. It was the most difficult season of my life. It was like we were on the edge of just falling away from this or that. Like there's this reality we have in the middle of these seasons that we name the season based off of the difficulty. But what does Abraham do? He doesn't base it off of his difficulty because he could have named it the Mount of Sacrifice. He could have named it the Mount of Obedience, the Mount of Testing. What does he name it? This is the mountain where the Lord provides. I wonder if there's more to this. And this is not to diminish your struggle. I want you to hear me. This is not to diminish your struggle. But we might say, man, that season was the hardest time of my life. But we could say is that, man, I watched God provide over and over in the middle of a difficult season. You see the difference? It's not mind games. It's faith. To say the Lord has provided over and over in the middle of these difficult seasons. Worship team, you can come. What's interesting to me about this story is that this mountain would play a huge role in the life of Israel, in our life for that matter. This mount that Abraham is called to go to, Mount Moriah, is where they would eventually build the first temple in the city of Jerusalem. Right on top of this mountain, and thousands of years later, there would be a son that would come and be sacrificed on this very mountain. This is the very mountain, as we read the Gospels, the story of where Jesus was crucified. Barnabas Piper, John Piper's son, says this. In Genesis, Abraham's only son was set to be sacrificed and was saved by God's miraculous provision. In the Gospels, God's only son was sacrificed as the miraculous provision for all people. God provided just what Abraham needed on that mountain, and God provided what humanity needed on that same mountain. See, we look at this, and we can trust and we know that God sees and that God provides. And today, we're still benefiting from the Lord providing on that mountain. He provided for Abraham in that moment. And the truth is he's providing for you now. Many times the provision of Jehovah is seen on the other side of a struggle.